Most source games are similar enough that you can load a map from one game in another. Missing files will be a problem though. With the Half-Life 2 episodes though, loading a map from base Half-Life 2 isn't much of a problem. In order to save storage space, the episodes don't come with copies of files from the base game unless they modified them. If they need to use a file that they don't have, they'll just load it from HL2. Episode 2 does the same thing with Episode 1. The real problem with the episodes is the stuff that they did change. Those versions of files weren't made for Half-Life 2, so some weird stuff can happen, but the weirdest issue by far is what happens on Coast 8, and only in pre-20th anniversary versions and mods. That's it. You just instantly mission fail for no apparent reason. How? Figuring out what's happening requires that you know how to debug problems in Source and in programs in general. If we use Developer 2 in the console, we can see some messages that say that it's because the buggy hit the trigger that detects when it's fallen down into the water, which, yeah, I mean, what else was it going to be? But this doesn't actually have anything to do with the buggy. We can delete it and see that the mission fail still happens. So then what? Is there some other vehicle or something? That's not out of the question. We've seen before that on some maps, pushing an APC into water will cause a mission fail. We're going to have to get more involved here to understand what's happening. This is Hammer, which is the program that all of Half-Life 2's maps were made in, and this is BSP Source, which is a map decompiler, which will put Half-Life 2's maps back into a different file format that can be opened in Hammer. We're going to use this to learn more about the trigger. We know from the messages that the name of the trigger we're looking for is Jeep Fall Trigger, so we find that in Hammer. You can't miss it. So let's look at this trigger. It's very big, as it should be, it extends all the way down to the water, and it's connected to a filter entity. The flags on this trigger are set to detect clients and physics objects, which means the player and any physically simulated object. Now, obviously, if you throw something into the water or just jump down, you don't get the mission fail, and that's because the purpose of the filter entity is to restrict what can activate the trigger in more detail, so let's look at that. The filter entity's class name is Filter Activator Class, which means it filters entities by their class name. An entity's class name tells what kind of thing it is. The trigger is a trigger multiple, which is pretty much the go-to trigger entity. Anyway, the filter is set to look for prop vehicle Jeep, which is the class name of the buggy, and, get this, not allow it, meaning anything except the buggy is allowed to activate the trigger. So, multiple questions to ask here. Why is this trigger set up to do the exact opposite of what it's intended to do, and why does it work as intended anyway, but only in base HL2? The first question we'll probably never really know. Shit happens in development. The ways things work changes and some things inevitably fall through the cracks. But let's try to answer that second question. After performing some other very serious investigations, I have many more facts to share. The mission fail only happens when we come into Coast 8 from Coast 7. If you start a new game on Coast 8, everything is normal. If you put a buggy in the trigger with the command create Jeep, the trigger works like it should, and that's the only thing that can activate the trigger. You can also go back and forth between the two maps as many times as you want, and everything will still be normal. Coast 7 of course has its own version of the trigger for the buggy, but it's the same exact setup aside from having a different name and being larger. Finally, let's notice that the filter entities on both maps are set up wrong. Not just because they're set up to do the exact opposite of what they should, but also because their syntax is just wrong. The option for negation on a filter is a Boolean value. A Boolean is either true or false and nothing else. In map files, 0 means false and 1 means true. The actual options on the setting are allow entities that match criteria, which corresponds to 0, meaning the filter will allow the class name that was specified, and disallow entities that match criteria, which corresponds to 1, meaning the filter will invert or negate what is allowed. These filters, however, are just set to no. This is improper, but it's far from an isolated incident. There are thousands of instances across all source games where a setting that's meant to be represented by a 0 or 1 was given a string value that does nothing more than state the level designer's intent in a human-readable form. This comes from Valve's bad FGD files. FGD files are what tell Hammer about what entities exist in a game and what settings they have. They are not necessarily accurate. Many of the default settings for booleans are those strings when they should be 0s or 1s. I really could not tell you why. I try not to do the whole spaghetti code shtick on my channel because it annoys me, but you really did earn it this time, Valve. This is crazy. Well, anyway, it seems like this no is normally interpreted as false, which is convenient, but we still don't know why it seems to get interpreted as true instead, specifically when we're playing a pre-anniversary build of episode 1 or 2, and apparently only when going from Coast 7 to Coast 8. If we're going to figure this out, we've got to dig deeper. This is the 2013 single-player SDK. It's basically a snapshot of Half-Life 2's code as it was in 2013. This is how mods are made. This is Visual Studio, which is an integrated developer environment, which is in short a program that helps you program. Using Visual Studio, we can compile the SDK, do the steps to reproduce the mission fail, and then we can inspect everything that happens. So then we go to the code for the entity filter activator class. What you see here is some code that ties this class name to this code class. And yep, there's all the code for that entity. Inheritance is a hell of a drug. This here is what tests to see if the class name in question is the one the entity is searching for. So then we press F9 to put a breakpoint on this line of code so that when the game reaches that point, it'll pause and we can see what's going on. One executing of those steps later. Okay, so there are way too many big triggers with a bunch of crap inside them, which is causing the breakpoint to get hit over and over and making it impossible to find what we really want, so we'll use an assert instead. An assert is the same idea as a breakpoint, but it only activates when some condition is not met. Basically, you're asserting that something is true. We're going to assert that the filter does not allow whatever entity it's being tested against, which means it'll only pause when something actually does activate the trigger. Okay, so we cause the mission fail again, and no pause. This means nothing ever actually passes the filter over the course of the bug's occurrence, so all that junk I said about booleans and default values was totally irrelevant. While I was looking around in code, I saw the line that makes it so that if an entity has passed every other criteria and the trigger doesn't have a filter entity, it proceeds with activating the trigger as opposed to testing against a filter entity that doesn't exist. So my new theory is that the trigger is somehow not able to find its filter. I don't know how that could be, but there's not really any other explanation. So this time, we'll assert that the filter does exist, or the trigger does not have one of the names we're looking for. That means we pause if the trigger we want does not have a filter. And this time, we do hit the assert. There is some point where the trigger for the buggy is missing its filter. We can also put the original breakpoint back on the filter entity and see that the second assert gets activated, then the breakpoint starts getting hit. The thing that sets off the trigger the moment we enter Coast 8 is this boat from Coast 7. When you go from one map to another, nearby things will transfer over into the new map. When you load Coast 8 from a new game, that boat isn't there because levels are made in a way that assumes those objects from Coast 7 will be there. Sure enough, if we break the boat and wait for the pieces to despawn before going to Coast 8, the mission fail doesn't happen and everything once again works like normal. So then why don't we see the mission fail on Coast 7? We'll just have to take this one step at a time. For now, let's focus on why the filter is missing. Before we go any further, let's make sure our asserts activate or don't activate when we expect them to if we start the game from Coast 8 and mess around a bit like we did before. Yes, everything is working how we think it does so far. I get the feeling this is coming down to the order in which different parts of code get executed, so let's take a close look at when triggers acquire their filters during initialization. Triggers use the first filter that they find with a name matching the one in their settings in a list of every entity that currently exists. We'll put a breakpoint here. Okay, yep, we hit the assert for missing the filter, then we hit the breakpoint for when the filter gets acquired, which happens successfully, then we start hitting the breakpoint inside the filter. When looking around in where this activate function is called from, we see a fun comment. Hack, undone. We need to redesign the main loop with respect to save/load/server activate. Okay, but wait, what happens in other cases? When we start a new game from Coast 7, we're seeing the filter get acquired before any checks for what can activate the trigger, which is what we would hope to see. When we start a new game from Coast 8, we see the same thing, although in this case I expected to see nothing at all immediately touching the trigger. Apparently there is some wooden pallet touching it though. We can get this prop's coordinates with the debugger in Visual Studio and then use this command to go out there. Well, what do you know? I also noticed that the way we reach the activate function is slightly different when going to coast 8 from 7. In both cases, activate is called from a function called server activate, but when we're loading a new game, that's called from somewhere in engine code, and when we're transitioning to a new map, it's called from a function called end restore entities, which is called from some function which is purporting that it's called when a player is fully active. My mind is immediately jumping to an engine quirk speedrunners know well. For a split second at the end of a loading screen, the game is actually running before the loading screen disappears. This is how you can appear to be already dead after loading a save you made just before dying. If there is some way to confirm it's coming from that, I don't know it. Apparently you can avoid the delay if you emulate a multiplayer server by setting max players to something other than 1, but doing so also makes it impossible to transition to new levels. And no, we can't just modify either of those things to work in a way better suited for our needs, because both of those things just happen to be in a section of code not included in the 2013 SDK. Thank you, Valve. We might learn something if we observe the code running correctly as it does in base Half-Life 2. So I used the base HL2 binaries and, well, it all works how we expect. Well, this is getting us nowhere. Time for a change in approach. I searched in the code for episodic. You're basically guaranteed to see this keyword around any feature that's exclusive to the episodes. And wouldn't you know it, right there in baseentity.cpp, in a function related to level transitions called onRestore, which is called before activate, there's some odd looking behavior with touching triggers which was set up to not happen specifically in base Half-Life 2. Alright, let's get rid of this and see what happens. No mission fail. Okay, so what is this code doing and why did Valve write it? Well, first we set this variable called disable touch functions to false if we were loading into the map from another one, and true if we were instead loading a save. This code is only visited in either of those two scenarios. Starting a new game doesn't go anywhere near this code, which explains why that wooden pallet wasn't causing the mission fail. Also, in the case of transitioning levels, onRestore is only run on an entity if it was transferred over from the last map, which is why we don't see the mission fail when we go from Coast 8 to 7, because the boat isn't being restored, it's being spawned for the first time. Even if we go back to 8 and then to 7 again, we still don't get the mission fail because by then the trigger has acquired the filter. When two objects touch while disable touch functions is true, they do not react in any special way to the touch. They just internally note that they're touching and do their usual physics calculations if need be. In our case, this means the trigger won't actually detect any of the stuff touching it. Remember, this variable is only true if we're loading a save. The purpose of noting if two things touch is multifaceted, I'm sure, but one major reason is that some triggers don't detect when something begins touching them, but rather when something stops touching them, or if they're touching them at a specific point in time. After setting the variable to either true or false, it runs some code to detect what triggers are being touched and then possibly have the triggers react to them. Then disable touch functions is set back to false. Let's take a moment to remember that the trigger that detects the buggy on Coast 7 is not the one that detects it on Coast 8. Triggers don't transfer between maps. Barring the filter entity, the trigger on Coast 8 should not ignore the boat when it does acknowledge the pallet. Both things instantly began existing inside the trigger. The only difference is that the boat is detected before acquiring the filter, so this is the right code, it's just in the wrong place. My immediate suspicion is that if we move this code to cbase entity's activate function instead of onRestore and remove the exception to keep this from happening in base HL2, everything will suddenly work fine, because then the touch functions won't run until after the filter is acquired. Well, it's a start. Now we're in a race to see if the boat or the trigger executes their activate function first. Remember, the trigger on Coast 7 is not the trigger on Coast 8, so copying the code for getting the filter into cbase trigger's onRestore function would do nothing because we would never reach that code. Well then, why not copy it to the trigger's spawn function? I looked around for a bit and it's clear that spawn is called before activate, but after every entity has been loaded into memory, so this should work. And yep, everything is working correctly now, at least with this one trigger in this one map in this one situation. There's a decent chance something else broke because of these changes, but I'm not gonna bother to find out. Let's pay attention to the fact that Valve made the, almost correct behavior happen in everything except base HL2. Usually when Valve would make some new behavior for the episodes, they would make it exclusive to the episodes, not exclude it from everything except base HL2. This suggests they might have been having a bug caused by this code in an HL2 map, possibly this exact one. More likely though, it was simple cautiousness because they recognized how unwieldy yet fundamental this code change might be and they didn't want to break the HL2 maps. Even if it is wrong, it's more cost effective to let it be wrong as long as the end result is what was intended. It is pretty funny that all of this could have been avoided if Valve had just made the trigger thin so it never touched any of that junk below. If you remember from the start of the video, I said that this bug doesn't happen in the 20th anniversary versions. So did Valve fix the code or make the trigger thin? No. They just removed the trigger. So now, even when playing in normal circumstances, if the buggy did fall into the water, you wouldn't get a mission fail until you went back to Coast 7, which could permanently screw that save file. Oh, Valve.